Hi guys, I'm just going to start this video off with fuck you, Bill Gates.
Allowing these vaccines, as you say, the recipe for these vaccines to be shared would be helpful. Do you think that would be helpful?
No.
What do you mean no? See what I mean? Fuck you, Bill Gates.
No.
Why not?
Well, there's only so many vaccine factories in the world, and people are very serious about the safety of vaccines. And so moving something that had never been done, moving a vaccine from, say, a J&J factory into a factory in India, that it's novel. It's only because of our grants and our expertise that can happen at all.
What the fuck is this rich piece of shit talking about? Of all examples to pick as well, he picks Johnson & Johnson. Hey, alright. Johnson & Johnson suffers another setback as FDA tells MD vaccine maker to suspend production. The pause in production follows the contamination of 15 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine in March. Why the fuck did he pick these examples?
A J&J factory into a factory in India.
And you see what I mean by why did he pick these examples? Why did he go with India? Because this is from the ABC. With a reputation as the pharmacy of the world, India is geared to mass produce COVID-19 vaccines. And here's another article. Not without India. World's pharmacy gears up for vaccine race. I'll read a bit of this article for you as well. India, the world's biggest vaccine maker, is getting set for the massive global blitz to contain the coronavirus pandemic, with its pharmaceutical industry and partners freeing up capacity and accelerating investments even without firm purchase orders. India manufactures more than 60% of all vaccines sold across the globe, and while its $40 billion pharmaceutical sector is not yet involved in the production of the expensive Pfizer Inc. and Moderna shots, the nation will play a pivotal role in immunizing much of the world. There are many vaccines being produced in countries around the world, but there's only one nation that has the manufacturing capacity to produce sufficient quantities to satisfy the demands of citizens in every country, and that's India, said Australia's ambassador to India, Barry O'Farrell. And you see, just because Bill Gates is rich doesn't mean he knows what the fuck he's talking about. He's obviously a massive fucking dickhead. And let's hear the rest of this greedy dickhead's answer to that question.
The thing that's holding things back in this case is not intellectual property. There's not like some idle vaccine factory with regulatory approval that makes magically safe vaccines. You've got to do the trials on these things, and every manufacturing process has to be looked at in a very careful way. There's all sorts of issues around intellectual property having to do with medicines, but not in terms of how quickly we've been able to ramp up the volume here. I remember how shocked people were when we said we were going to do second sources in these developing country factories. That was a novel thing, and we got all the rights from the vaccine companies. They didn't hold it back. They were participating. I do a regular phone call with the pharmaceutical CEOs to make sure that work is going at full speed.
Yeah, nah. If a billionaire is calling up the CEOs of companies in a particular industry, I'm not thinking it's to make sure stuff's coming along quickly and smoothly. I'm gonna think it's so they all answer to him and do what he wants. That's what that sounds like. Especially when you donate millions of dollars to these institutions that are doing this research. If you wanted to be a helpful, useful guy, you could just donate the money and keep your nose out of it. But making donations and then having little calls with everyone already makes it look like you want to control everything. And then you add on top of that the intellectual property rights. This is what evil looks like. Alright, and now I'd like to read you the start of an article. Like always, the links will be below. How Bill Gates impeded global access to COVID vaccines. Through his hallowed foundation, the world's de facto public health czar has been a stalwart defender of monopoly medicines. The 12th of April. On February 11, 2020, public health and infectious disease experts gathered by the hundreds at the World Health Organization's Geneva mothership. The official pronouncement of a pandemic was still a month out, but the agency's International Brain Trust knew enough to be worried. Burdened by a sense of borrowed time, they spent 2 days furiously sketching a R&D blueprint in preparation for a world upended by the virus then known as 2019 nCoV. The resulting document summarized the state of coronavirus research and proposed ways to accelerate the development of diagnosis, treatments, and vaccines. The underlying premise was that the world would unite against the virus. The global research community would maintain broad and open channels of communication, since collaboration, information sharing, minimize duplication, and accelerate discovery. The group also drew up plans for global comparative trials overseen by the World Health Organization to assess the merit of treatments and vaccines. One issue not mentioned in the paper, intellectual property. If the worst came to pass, the experts and researchers assumed cooperation would define the global response, with the World Health Organization playing a central role. That pharmaceutical companies and their allied governments would allow intellectual property concerns to slow things down, from research and development to manufacturing upscale, does not seem to have occurred to them. They were wrong, but they weren't alone. Battle-scarred veterans of the medicine access and open science movement hoped the immensity of the pandemic would override a global drug system based on proprietary science and market monopolies. By March, strange but welcome melodies could be heard from unexpected quarters. Anxious governments spoke of shared interests and global public goods. Drug companies pledged pre-competitive and no-profit approaches to development and pricing. The early days featured tantalizing glimpse of an open science cooperative pandemic response. In January and February 2020, a consortium led by the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases collaborated to produce atomic-level maps of the key vital proteins in record time. Work that would normally have taken months or possibly even years had been completed in weeks, noted the editor of The Nature. When the Financial Times editorized on March 27th that the world had an overwhelming interest in ensuring COVID-19 drugs and vaccines will be universally and cheaply available, the paper expressed what felt like a heartening conventional wisdom. This sense of possibility emboldened forces working to extend the cooperative model. Grounding their efforts was a plan started in early March to create a voluntary intellectual property pool inside the World Health Organization instead of putting proprietary walls around research and organizing it as a race. Public and private actors would collect research and associated intellectual property in a global knowledge fund for the duration of the pandemic. The idea became real in late May with the launch of the World Health Organization COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or CTAP. By then, however, the optimism and sense of possibility that defined the earlier days were long gone. Advocates for pooling and open science who seemed ascendant and even unstoppable that winter confronted the possibility they'd been outmatched and outmaneuvered by the most powerful man in global public health. In April, Bill Gates launched a bold bid to manage the world's scientific response to the pandemic. Gates' COVID-19 ACT Accelerator expressed a status quo version for organizing the research, development, manufacture, and distribution of treatments and vaccines. Like other Gates-funded institutions in the public health arena, the accelerator was a public-private partnership based on charity and industry enticements. Crucially, and in contrast to the CTAP, the accelerator enshrines Gates' long-standing commitment to respecting exclusive intellectual property claims. Its implicit argument that intellectual property rights won't present problems for meeting global demand or for ensuring equitable access, and they must be protected even during a pandemic, carried the enormous weight of Gates's reputation as a wise, beneficent, and prophetic leader. How he's developed and wielded this influence over 2 decades is one of the more consequential and unappreciated shapers of the failed global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Entering year 2, this response has been defined by a zero-sum vaccination battle that has left much of the world on the losing side. Gates's marquee COVID-19 initiative started relatively small. 2 days before the World Health Organization declared a pandemic on March 11, 2020, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation announced something called the Therapeutic Accelerator, a joint initiative with MasterCard and the charity group the Wellcome Trust to identify and develop potential treatments for the novel coronavirus, doubling as a social branding exercise for the giant of global finance. The accelerator reflected Gates's familiar formula for corporate philanthropy, which he has applied to everything from malaria to malnutrition. In retrospect, it was a strong indicator that Gates's dedication to monopoly medicine would survive the pandemic, even before his foundation's officers began to say so publicly. Advocates for pooling and open science, who seemed ascendant and even unstoppable earlier in the crisis, have been outmatched and outmaneuvered by the most powerful man in global public health. This was confirmed when a bigger version of the accelerator was unveiled the following month at the World Health Organization. The Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, or ACT Accelerator, was Gates's bid to organize the development and distribution of everything from therapeutics to testing. The big and most consequential arm, COVAX, proposed to subsidize vaccine deals with poor countries through donations by and sales to richer ones. The goal was always limited. It aimed to provide vaccines for up to 20% of the population in low to middle income countries. After that, governments would largely have to compete on the global market like everyone else. It was a partial demand-side solution to what the movement coalescing around the call for a people's vaccine warned would be a dual crisis of supply and access, with intellectual property at the center of both. Gates not only dismissed these warnings, but actively sought to undermine all challenges to his authority and the accelerator's intellectual property-based charity agenda. Early on, there was space for Gates to have a major impact in favor of open models, says Manuel Martin, a policy advisor to the Medicine Sans Frontier Access campaign. But senior people in the Gates organization very clearly sent out the message: pooling was unnecessary and counterproductive. They dampened early enthusiasm by saying that IP is not an access barrier in vaccines. That's just demonstrably false. Few have observed Bill Gates's devotion to monopoly medicine more closely than James Love, founder and director of Knowledge Ecology International, a Washington, D.C. based group that studies the broad nexus of federal policy, the pharmaceutical industry, and intellectual property. Love entered the world of global public health policy around the same time Gates did, and for 2 decades has watched him scale its heights while reinforcing the system responsible for the very problems he claims to be trying to solve. The through line for Gates has been his unwavering commitment to drug companies' rights to exclusive control over medical science and the market for its products. Things could have gone either way, says Love, but Gates wanted exclusive rights maintained. he acted fast to stop the push for sharing the knowledge needed to make the products. The know-how, the data, the cell lines, the tech transfers, the transparency, that is all critically important in a dozen ways. The pooling approach represented by CTAP included all of that. Instead of backing those early decisions, he raced ahead and signaled support for business as usual on intellectual property by announcing the ACT Accelerator in March. 1 year later, the ACT Accelerator has failed to meet its goal of providing discounted vaccines to the priority fifth of low-income populations. The drug companies and rich nations that had so much praise for the initiative a year ago have retreated into bilateral deals that leave little for anyone else. The low and middle income countries are pretty much on their own, and there's just not much out there, says Peter Holtz, Dean of the National School for Tropical Medicine in Houston. Despite their best efforts, the Gates model and its institutions are still industry dependent. As of this writing in early April, fewer than 600 million vaccine doses have been administered around the world. 3/4 of those in just 10 mostly high-income countries. Close to 130 countries containing 2.5 billion people have yet to administer a single dose. The timeline for supplying poor and middle-income countries with enough vaccine to achieve herd immunity, meanwhile, has been pushed into 2024. These numbers represent more than the catastrophic moral failure the Director General of the World Health Organization warned about this January. It is a stark reminder that any policy that obstructs or inhibits vaccine production risks being self-defeating. For those rich countries defending exclusive rights and gobbling up the lion's share of available vaccine supplies, the truth repeated so often throughout the pandemic, no one is safe until everyone is safe, remains in force. This easily anticipated market failure, together with the CTAP's failure to launch, led developing countries to open a new front against intellectual property barriers in the World Trade Organization in October. The WTO Trade Relations Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights Council has been center ring in a dramatic north-south standoff over rights to control vaccine knowledge, technology, and markets. More than 100 low and middle-income countries support a call by India and South Africa to waive certain provisions related to COVID-19 intellectual property for the duration of the pandemic. Although Gates and his organization do not have an official position on the debate roiling the WTO, Gates and his deputies have left little doubt about their opposition to the waiver proposal, just as he did following the rollout of the World Health Organization CTAP. Gates has chosen to stand with the drug companies and their government patrons.
The recipe for these vaccines to be shared would be helpful. Do you think that would be helpful?
No.
Doesn't think it'd be helpful to share the information we have on the vaccines with each other as the same person who decided to just take control of the vaccines. Now let's have one more listen to the other ridiculous thing he fucking said.
J&J factory into a factory in India.
Yeah, why would you want the place that seems to make most vaccines to make the vaccines? Now I just want to quickly revisit this article I showed you at the start of the video. This is from December 10th, 2020. Not without India, world's pharmacy gears up for vaccine race. SII plans to make a total of 400 million doses of Covishield by July, and it's setting up new production lines to roll out roughly 1 billion shots a year. Indian companies are set to produce 8 more affordable vaccines designed to fight COVID-19, including AstraZeneca's Covishield, called the Vaccine for the World by its developers. With nearly 10 million infections, the world's second highest after the United States, India's government is likely to order a huge chunk of the vaccines for its 1.3 billion people. So all in all, the point I want to make with this video is, thanks to Bill Gates, Gates and his trusty sidekick drug companies, under their favorite banner of capitalism, went to the world's pharmacy and set it on fucking fire.